Hello and welcome everybody to the Institute for Government. I'm Julian McRae. I'm Deputy Director at the Institute. I'm chairing this event this lunchtime. No need to really mention the profound changes that are going on within the UK and how we govern it at the moment. We've been doing a series of work around Brexit, looking at how Whitehall might structure itself, implications for the union and how that operates. And as we move into August, September, we're going to be taking a slightly wider view, looking at the governability of the UK and how that works with changes in traditional party structures and in how politicians and the public may be relating to each other. But for today, we're focusing on one of the core issues around Brexit, which is the UK's future relationship with the EU. I'm delighted that we've got a really excellent panel here today to take us through some of these issues. If I start on my far left with Michel Petite, who is currently at Clifford Chance, but working on European Union community law and competition policy, but has previously held some extremely senior roles inside the European Commission, most recently as the Director General of Legal Services. Then we have Agata Gostyńska, I'm sure I've got that wrong, I'm afraid, but is a research fellow at the the Centre for European Reform and has worked extensively on EU decision-making and institutional architecture. We have then Sir Andrew Cahn, who is formerly Chief Executive of UK Trade and Investment, but has also worked at the Commission, most notably is the Chef de Cabinet for Neil Kinnock when he was Vice President of the Commission, has also worked inside UK government, including as Deputy Head, I think, of the European Secretariat at the Cabinet Office. To my right, I have Hannah White, who is a Programme Director at the Institute and is leading our work around Brexit. And then finally, I have Mark Sidwell, who is Permanent Secretary at the Home Office, but previously in a very wide career, but was previously the Director General Political at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and also has been the Prime Minister's Special Representative in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The format we're using today, for some of you who are regulars at our events, is slightly different to one we normally use. What we're actually going to do is something a little bit akin to question time. We thought there were quite a lot of issues in this, and we wanted to sort of structure our way a little bit more through the sort of questions and put particular questions to particular members of the panel as we go through. So you will all have seen, and some of you have indeed responded to our request for questions in advance that you were interested in raising. We've collated those and brought them together to cover three sort of key sort of questions that we have, three themes that we want to go through. What could the future relationship look like with the EU? What are the big sort of issues there? How will the negotiations work in practice? There's some sort of legal constraints and things like that, but what's actually going to happen as these go forward? And the final bit we wanted to touch on, how can the government actually engage with the public more broadly in this? It's a process that's been kicked off through a referendum, but how will that public engagement go forward? I will try and take you through some of those questions. We'll pause after each of those areas to take some comments from the floor. You'll all probably have seen the programme, so you'll know roughly the format, keeping comments relatively brief and to the point to take the argument on would be much appreciated. And hopefully we'll manage in the time available to cover all the topics that people are interested in. But as usual, there might be a final hurried question at the end. We shall see how we do on that. So just to start off, we'll start with what does the future relationship with the EU look like? What are the options and what are the areas? One of the things that a lot of people have been talking about is the different types of models that we could have. These have come to be known by national shorthands. We've got the Norway model, the Switzerland model, and so on. I was just wondering, what are the tangible differences between them and for whom? Hannah, would you like to just start off for that?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of these models, there are probably, it's very complicated, but you can, in a sense, simplify it into three main variables. So the first is the extent of access a country gets to what people see as the benefits of EU membership. So that would be things like the single market, but also the opportunity to participate in things which are done collectively in terms of things like security. So that's one variable for these models. The second variable is what a country is required to sign up to in order to get that access. So that includes maybe a financial contribution, but also following the rules and regulations that the EU sets. And the third variable within these models is really about the influence a country then has over how those rules and policies and so on develop. So if you look on the one hand at countries like Norway and Switzerland, their sort of model of a relationship with the EU involves some degree of access to the benefits, but also signing up to rules and regulations, including free movement of people, and really quite limited influence over EU policy development. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got the WTO model, which doesn't involve the benefits of EU membership, but also doesn't involve the costs and signing up to the regulations. And then in the middle, you've got the sort of free trade agreements, which are the countries like Canada and Singapore have succeeded in negotiating, if not quite getting ratified yet. And those sorts of deals involve sort of some limited benefits, but not having to sign up to as many of the rules or to make financial contributions.
Thanks, Hannah. Andrew, what are your thoughts on the different models and which ones are really plausible and which ones should we really be looking to pursue? What are the differences, the fundamental differences between them?
Well, Julian, I can't see that either the Norway model or the Switzerland model are going to be runners. The Norway model, essentially because Britain would, it would almost be contrary to the referendum outcome, because we would still be making a very substantial budgetary contribution. We would still be bound by the free movement rules, and we would have none of the advantages of membership, but most of the disadvantages. So I just can't see in the end that runs politically. And the Switzerland model is very sui generis, and I can't see that running in the sense that the European side is very unhappy with the Swiss model and deeply regrets that it went down that road. The WTO model clearly is a runner, though one thing which I haven't seen said but seems to me to be a real problem is that we would have to negotiate our re-entry into the WTO. That would take a very substantial period of time. And it isn't as if we leave the EU one day and WTO rules apply to us fully the next day. Once we left, we would have to negotiate entry, and that could take several years. So there is the problem of a hiatus, which I think is a huge unspoken problem out there. So the model I think we'll find ourselves going for is a UK model. And Britain is bigger, weightier, more substantial than Switzerland or Norway or Liechtenstein. I think we do have more negotiating weight. I think it's in the interest of both sides to find a solution. And I'm sure there is one there. There is a UK model to be found, which but whether the politics and indeed the timing allow us to do that, I have some doubts.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Mark, I was just wondering, I mean, inside this, a set of questions were about the balance that would be struck by the UK government between single market and controls on immigration is one issue. I don't know whether you can say anything about how that balance might be struck. But I think another issue is, of course, the security sort of aspects of this and the relationship there. And you think that might be easier than some of the other areas because there's a commonality of interest in that across the European continent. Yeah, thanks. I mean, I essentially share the overall analysis that we've heard so far. We've been describing it very similarly. There's essentially a series of multilateral arrangements, still with some kind of multilateral framework, and I put both Norway and Switzerland into that kind of basket, where there are both obligations and benefits, but within a multilateral framework. There's a series of There's a bilateral framework, a bit like Canada and Japan are trying to negotiate on free trade, but that would also involve much more control, of course, over immigration and borders than we would have in
at least with the current free movement arrangement. And then there is, as Andrew was just describing, essentially the arrangement. If we're just another country, there isn't a special agreement for the UK, or there hasn't been one by the time that we conclude the negotiations, and then we'd be on the trade side under a WTO framework on the assumption we were able to navigate our way to that, and our relations with the EU on borders and immigration would be like our relations with the United States or Canada or another country. And of course there's loads of variations, but I think it is quite helpful, as you were suggesting, Hannah, to think of it in that context. For the Home Office, obviously the immigration and borders is one of the key issues, and it's the central issue here. I was just listening to the Prime Minister briefly in Prime Minister's questions, and it came up there. This question of access to the single market versus restrictions on free movement. As Andrew said, the referendum outcome is quite clear that there will have to be significant changes to free movement, and the Prime Minister has been clear about that. In whatever arrangement we reach with the EU, and then essentially the question becomes how much access to the single market, to a free trading arrangement, do we and they agree is appropriate. On security and law enforcement, there's a very strong common interest in maintaining this. The UK is a big contributor. We've shaped a lot of the EU's security and law enforcement agenda. A lot of the regulations and arrangements are ones that we've either adapt some of ours in many ways, or indeed that we have shaped and negotiated, and we bring a great deal to that, whether it's dealing with some of the terrorist threats or organised criminal threats, the migration crisis and so on. And I think at least among member states there's a strong sense that we should, as far as possible, reinforce that kind of cooperation, whatever the institutional framework that's set by the big discussion about free movement and the single market. And to be honest, that's what we're trying to do anyway. There's an EU-US agreement on data coming into force. We've got agreements with other countries in that way. The French and others do too. So this is something that is not peculiar to the EU. It's something that internationally all countries are seeking to do as we deal with transnational threats. And I would expect we'd want to continue to find a way of doing that in the most effective way possible. That's why we opted into many of the measures, and I would imagine whatever the institutional arrangements, we want to continue that.
Excellent, thanks, Mark. Agatha, just thinking about, obviously we've heard from the Prime Minister and others that free movement of labour is going to be one of those major issues. Again, another set of questions was just thinking, what is going to be the flexibility from the European side? What's realistic if we're coming to them with wanting restrictions around the free movement? How far can we go into the direction of EEA membership or anything like that, or is it just off the table? And I noticed you were nodding when Andrew was mentioning the WTO, so maybe you want to pick up on that as well.
Yeah, it's just more about the legal nitty-gritty that we've been all working on. But coming back to your question, I will be perfectly honest with you. I think that the prospect for the EU to concede on free movement of EU labour, or in other words, to give up on free movement of EU labour, are rather low. And we have seen it already after the result of the British referendum. The statement of the EU 27 member states was quite clear that the EU and Britain should look for a relationship that will be based on a balance of rights and obligations, and access to single market means simply also maintaining free movement of EU labour. We've heard a lot about the ideas that Britain is the big economy and should get something special also with the respect to sort of free movement of EU labour. At some point to Norway, that actually in the agreement on the European Economic Area, it has this possibility, to curb migration, but it has never really taken advantage of it. And why? It hasn't really used this sort of opportunity, because it knows that within the same agreement it is clearly stated that the EU would be able to retaliate and basically to limit access to Norwegian goods or services. Then others point to Liechtenstein, that actually the EU has enabled Liechtenstein to impose some quotas
on migration. But again, Britain is no Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein is the population of Liechtenstein is around 37,000 people, and the economy is much less relevant to EU and the other way around. So I think that the flexibility will be limited with the respect to free movement of free labor.
Okay, thank you. And Michel, a lot of the Leave commentators made quite an amount about the nature that the UK is no Liechtenstein. As Andrew said, we're actually quite a large economy. And is there, possibilities of the sort of sweetheart deal of Germany and its car makers and car exporters really wanting something that's quite different to what other people have been able to negotiate so far? So these fixed points that people are talking about, is there any sense that they're not realistic, that actually we can go a lot further when we're doing these negotiations?
Well, certainly it's too early to say. And before, deciding whether the negotiation is going to be a punishment negotiation or a sweetheart deal, I think we have to evaluate sort of cool-bloodedly what is feasible and what is not feasible. On the link with free movement of workers, flexibility will be scarce probably, but will exist. As we've seen, for example, in February with the interim agreement. I mean, in a way, it was a slight flexibility in the sort of existing dogma of free movement of workers. I'm much more doubtful on access to the internal market, because people tend to confuse free trade and internal market. Free trade means no tariff or low tariff, no quotas or low quotas, no gross non-tariff barriers, and that's it. An internal market means the free circulation, automatic, of goods and services. It's a huge difference. Yeah. Now, access to the internal market means by necessity that you implement the existing EU law. UK can say, well, that's easy, we've just been there, so we have it. Except that all the precedents, Norway, Switzerland, Monaco, which is now sort of negotiating a deal with the EU on access to the internal market, are told you must commit to future EU law, otherwise it doesn't work. It does not work, that's the problem. And on top of that, you need to have a sort of institution which harmonizes these or interprets these regulations, and that's the Court of Justice of Luxembourg, which is imposed either in the form of the Court of Luxembourg itself, that would be the case for Switzerland, for Monaco, probably. For Norway, it takes another form of a court which is a sort of dependent, a mini Court of Luxembourg, much more cozy, but still there. And nobody sees the magic solution to extract oneself from there. So unless you commit to implementing future EU law and a court to that effect, I don't see how full access to the internal market can be dealt with. So it can be free trade plus. There will be a lot of debates about, well, if there is no passport for financial services, will there be a recognition of equivalence? To what extent? That is the basis on which, in my view, the negotiation will take place.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, just following up on that, what do you think the best outcome the UK might aim for at this particular point? What's the realistic sort of set we should be looking at?
I agree. I think Michel has expressed absolutely precisely the dilemma we face. I think we cannot expect to be part of the internal part of the internal market, because the British people have said, actually a subsection of British people, but the British political class have generally decided that we do not want to be part of the institutional structures of the European Union. If we're not, we can't be part of a single market. So I think the best thing from our perspective is to have as open a free trade agreement as we can. try and get some special arrangements for financial and professional services. Not sure at all that that's doable, but I think that one must clearly try. And as Mark said, try and focus on a whole series of other areas where there are clear common interests. I mean, Mark was talking about security, but it's also, it's common foreign and security policy. There's a huge similar interest on foreign policy. And on a whole series of other areas like environmental policy, we have really common interests in how do we implement the Paris Agreement, what sort of restrictions do we put on carbon emissions. So there are all sorts of areas like that where we can find common ground, even on things like international aid. There's a lot of areas where, so I mean, I would have hoped that we can find agreement to work together. But I think the idea that we can have the benefits of access to the single market without a commitment to the institutional structures, including the European Court of Justice, is idle. I mean, it just won't fly.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Michel, just to come back to one point before I take comments from the audience. You mentioned right at the start whether it would be a punishment negotiation or a sweetheart negotiation. There's been some reports of conflict between the Council and the Commission as to who exactly is going to be leading on the negotiations, at least in the British press. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But what's your sort of sense of, will it make a difference which of the European institutions is actually taking the lead in this as to which type of negotiation, which type of negotiating partner we're going to actually be facing?
Well, it's mainly a sense of déjà vu. The Council and the Commission have between themselves a kind of grey zone for which they are sort of fighting. There's no doubt about that. But the process is more or less established. So what you will have is a combination of the two. You will need to have a mandate requested by the Commission, which will therefore have to sort of draft it, will be adopted by the Council. Then the Commission will negotiate. And usually the conflict between the Council and the Commission falls on to what extent can the Council follow over the shoulder of the Commission day after day how the negotiation is processed. So the Commission has begun to react and to say, well, I'd negotiate. If you don't agree with the end product, you can refuse. You can also look over my shoulder from time to time, but not daily. It is the type of, really sort of trivial conflicts of administrations which you will find. I think there is nothing serious about it. You need two. You need both, basically. And you forget one, which is going to be the European Parliament. Article 50 requires the assent of the European Parliament on top of an easy qualified majority of the Council. And the problem may well be in the Parliament rather than in the Council.
And of course, not only the Parliament, but the member states themselves subsequently, and in some member states, regional authorities. So this is a multi-dimensional negotiation. There may be only one side on the UK, but there are 40 or so on the other side, and it will be quite a time-consuming process to get all those ducks in a row.
Excellent. We'll come back to the negotiations and how they might work in a few moments, but I just wanted to take any comments or very short questions from the audience on the issues we've just been covering. Gentleman there.
Thank you. I'm Alex Murdoch. I'm an emeritus professor and work in various European universities. I wonder whether, having taught negotiation skills, the fact that there are so many parties on the other side is the biggest advantage the UK has got. We are united, they are inevitably divided. And that, that when you have a whole bunch of stakeholders on the other side, then you can just sit back and say, sort yourselves out and let us know when you've done it.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other thoughts or comments before I come back to the panel? This gentleman here.
Alistair Smith, Competition and Markets Authority. Just a question of whether Andrew Cahn was perhaps oversimplifying the position with regard to goods and services. The single market isn't just about services, and if we have free trade in goods, there are an awful lot of regulations car safety regulations, noise regulations, and so on that apply to trade in goods. So getting a free trade area in goods doesn't mean that the single market only needs to be worried about in relation to financial services.
Okay, and then two gentlemen here, and I'll come back there.
William Wallace, I want to explore a bit further the relationship between free trade and single market, which has been blurred extremely badly in the referendum debate, and I must say from the outside it looks as if the ministers negotiating don't entirely understand the distinction yet. The coalition government did have a very extensive consultation exercise on the single market called the EU Balance of Competence Exercise, and that fed back with several thousand pieces of evidence on the extent to which British industry, British professional services, including legal and other such services, were satisfied with the current balance. Has that now been buried 18 months after it was all completed, or will that be fed back into the discussion, perhaps to educate some of our new ministers?
Excellent, thank you. And then the gentleman here.
Thank you. Very much aware that this is about the UK and the EU's relationship, but within that, how much influence do you think other nations around the world are likely to have on this? So things like, is the G7 or G20 going to play a part? Britain's approach to negotiating, say, with Australia, or something, there's some movement with China or the US, is that likely to play a role, either a soft role or a hard role in these negotiations?
Excellent, thank you. So I think we've got a series of questions. Our ultimate advantage is the problems of the EU. Maybe, Agatha, you might want to pick up on that, about how they negotiate. Andrew, you're being far too simplistic, which will be a first time in my experience of you, but anyway. The balance of competencies got lost somewhere in review and got picked up, Mark. And then finally, something that we haven't picked up on, and maybe people will want to comment more generally, what's the international dimension? Is there other players in the world than just the UK and the other EU members? But Agatha, do you want to sort of just kick us off on
Thank you very much for this observation, which I actually find extremely interesting. That we are quite used to EU, speaking with so many voices, and actually to this EU's cacophony, really, which in a way, you are right, may play into Britain's hand. I'm not sure if Britain is so united on those negotiations. I think that the Scotland, will have its role and probably a say as well, and not necessarily, something that the government would like to hear. I'm not an expert on this, so I will leave it to other colleagues. I must admit, it was really striking to see that after the result of the referendum, there was no common response from the EU. You had, 6 foreign ministers of the founding member states meeting, then, Visegrad countries being so upset about this, so that they had to organize another meeting. And this is definitely not the response that you would expect from the EU, which has just found out that one of its member states is leaving. Nevertheless, I think that the Article 50, creates some sort of legal but also procedural channels, which will also help to narrow perhaps different approaches, something that Michel already mentioned. There may be some appetite within institutions, but also perhaps some member states to punish Britain. But I think that the idea that we should have a sort of amicable divorce will prevail. And at the end of the day, the withdrawal agreement, as far as I'm concerned, only requires, if it's not mixed agreement, qualified majority. So you don't even need a consensus of all member states, although politically it would be something very difficult to sell. I mean, obviously, I think that the moment that we really should observe is when actually member states meet and negotiate the mandate for the EU institution, whether it is the Commission or another EU negotiator. And then this is when actually I guess that there will be a role for perhaps Donald Tusk, who so far has been quite sensible about how the EU should approach Britain to try to narrow individual stances. But I would underline perhaps that it seems to me there will be some red flags. And one of the red flags would be probably free movement of EU labour. And if I may just comment on what Michel said earlier on, I agree that the February deal showed that there is some flexibility within member states, but we shouldn't forget that the deal was about access to in-work benefits and access basically to, or child allowance, rather than free movement of EU labour itself. And I think that this is the principle which the EU leaders will try to maintain.
Andrew, did you want to pick up on Alistair's point about free trade, single market?
Well, the one thing I'd say is I see no prospect of us being part of the single market, in the sense that, as now, a British lorry, or indeed a French lorry, leaving Dover and arriving on the other side of the channel, just drives straight off. There will be an enormous amount of paperwork to be sort of dealt with. There will be, therefore, it will be a different sort of trade from currently. I just make an observation that we will have some sort of border between Northern and Southern Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. When I was a baby civil servant in the Ministry of Agriculture, I remember well something called the carousel trade, which was you would export agricultural produce out of Northern Ireland into the Republic with the benefit of subsidies, or at the time something called monetary compensatory amounts. And then you would bring the stuff back over the border at night, not going through the border post, and then you just move it backwards and forwards. You've got an awful lot of money out of the EU budget that way, which fomented the troubles. I mean, Mark knows far more about this than I do, but I do see a significant problem which perhaps we deal with later, about the reintroduction of some sort of border controls between the two parts of Ireland.
Yes, well, growing up in Dublin, I'm not sure that it quite ended after you ceased to be a baby civil servant. I think that probably still continues quite a bit today. But Mark, picking up on the balance of competencies sort of review, and where are they, and how is the UK government using them now, if at all? So
all of that material, of course, is being poured over by the people currently trying to get their teeth into the latest series of challenges in the new department, but also Department for International Trade, mine, etc. There's a great deal of other material as well, of course. In my department, we had all of the work we did on the Protocol 36 opt-in and opt-out, when we opted into 35 of about 100 or so measures. So there's a huge amount of material there, and don't worry, it's not all being discarded. We're bringing it back. We're bringing it back out. Much of it actually was considered during the referendum campaign, when the government was producing its own information documents in the period before PERDA kicked in order to set out essentially what the pros and cons were of membership. So a lot of that material is still there and be the basis of what we use as we formulate the government's position. Just on the more general point, and the last question, which I think actually is a great question, it's a really important one. It is, as everybody has said, our European partners are going to remain our closest neighbours, our closest partners, and indeed our allies within NATO for the most part. The overlap being almost total, and it is in everyone's interests that this process is amicable and we end up in a strong and positive partnership at the end of it. It is in no one's interest to see this go any other way. And that's very much the argument that we'll be making. And that is also true of other countries. It is not in the interest of other NATO allies, it's not in the interest of other big economies, countries who care about the issues that Andrew mentioned earlier, climate change, the environment, governance of the seas, international law, that there is some kind of fractious divorce between the UK and the EU as we go through this. So, of course, it's going to be a tough negotiation. The challenges, the technical challenges are immense. There are a lot of partners on the other side, and lots of issues will play into this that aren't directly related to the negotiations, because that's the nature of politics in these circumstances. But we have to hold on to the fact that we want, at the end of this, to have a strong, positive partnership with our EU partners. It's just the institutional arrangements for that will change, and we have to maintain that attitude Otherwise, the negotiations themselves could make that harder. And the various examples Andrew gave, I mentioned some of the Justice and Home Affairs, the Security Corporation, Law Enforcement Corporation, where it is overwhelmingly in our interest to continue to exchange data, to know about criminals, for law enforcement to be cooperating with each other, and so on. But also the many other dossiers, and I don't see anyone in the room or outside it seeking to unravel that, and that's what we've got to maintain. If we can maintain that attitude, then at least we'll be going into these really knotty issues around the single market, free trade, immigration, free movement, with the right frame of mind, and then and hopefully we'll be able to come to a solution that works for both sides in that too.
Thanks, Mark. Michel, do you want to just pick up possibly on what Mark's saying about this breaking out of some of the different elements? From the EU side, do you think it's likely that people will be saying, look, actually some of these security issues and some of these other issues are different and we'll negotiate on them differently no matter what we're doing on the major side?
This is going to be part of the tactics of negotiation, of course. To take it from an angle of a series of different bilateral sectorial topics risks, of course, to be criticized by the EU side as being mere pick and choose, basically. You take that because you want that, you don't take that. And this is probably, at least in principle, a red flag. No pick and choose is probably one of the sort of motto you will hear a lot. In fact, there will be pick and choose because it cannot be done otherwise. And it will be pick and choose at a relatively lower level of integration. That is what free trade agreements are about, basically. So you can put in a sort of future association agreement a chapter on environment, on anything. Of course, the risk is that the minute it is not just trade, it becomes what we, in our jargon, call a mixed agreement. And at that point, it needs to be ratified by 27 member states. So you are in difficulty there, but it is probably unavoidable. I cannot imagine a just trade agreement between UK and the European Union. Just on pure trade matters, it would be so minimal, where all this political cooperation needs to be processed and kept and maintained. So I doubt it can be only a trade agreement. And it will need unanimity, but after all, why not? I mean, all these agreements usually are mixed and therefore ratified by all member states, and they are ratified. What you need is indeed a sort of relatively consensual negotiation on the substance.
Excellent, thank you. Right, and that takes us nicely on to the next sort of set of issues. How are these negotiations going to work in practice? One of the questions that's come up in this, and you'll have seen lots of press coverage on it, the Commission has stated question is that the Commission has stated about the order of events. Will it be UK triggers Article 50, the UK and the UK then negotiate the UK's exit, and then the UK and the EU will negotiate their future relationship? Michel, is that your understanding of what the actual legal process is, and then also what's the actual reality of how these negotiations would go forward?
So, the lawyer will reply to this question, yes, that is the process. Normally, you trigger Article 50, then you negotiate Brexit, and Brexit only. That is basically undoing the financial relationship between the UK and the EU, and sort of undoing the trade agreements with third countries, which is both are very complex matters. That will be the substance of the Article 50 negotiation. Then you can begin to think legally in terms of an agreement with the third country that UK has become in the meantime. So that's the legal sequence. You can only negotiate, technically, a third country agreement with a third country. In practice, there will be overlaps. Some of it is already integrated in Article 50. Article 50 has to be sort of processed in the light of the future relationship. So indeed you need to have a sort of prospect of where you want to go, what type of agreement you want to reach afterwards. But it won't be detailed. It will be only detailed probably in a second phase when at least the beginning of a mandate from the Commission has appeared, is being negotiated, and then informal discussions can begin. So there will be an overlap. But legally speaking, you can only sign the second once the first is signed.
Okay, thank you. Mark, does the UK government have a sort of view of how this is going to work, or is it still something we're sort of working our way through? And also, the different negotiations, I think there's the exit negotiation under Article 50 and the future relationship negotiation. Is the UK government sort of seeing those as quite distinct sets of negotiations? Do we see it as a single thing that may need different legal niceties, but effectively we're thinking about the whole proposition together?
So I think of course we can all find lawyers to help us argue either side of this, and I don't know whether the EU's are more expensive than ours or the other way around, but I'm sure lawyers are going to benefit from this set of activities over the next few years. I think the UK government position on the exact process has not yet sort of formulated or announced. I mean, obviously we've only had the new government in place for a week, and it is important that the government is able to put together a view on the process as well as on the substance of the process, and that'll be part of a discussion, of course, with our European partners. One of the things we will have to keep in mind is there has to be legal continuity through the moment of exit. So, if for example there is an outstanding European arrest warrant, it's quite clear if you talk to the judges, there has to be complete legal continuity to whatever arrangements were in place on the 31st of December at midnight and on the 1st of January a moment later. Otherwise, and this is true, of course, a whole range of other activities. Otherwise, you create legal uncertainty, and there could be just an enormous amount of disruption. So, while I understand Michel's point about the fact that the Article 50 negotiations will have overlaps, I think in practice we're going to have a pretty clear view of exactly where we're going to move to immediately afterwards, recognising that, as with accessions, there will be a practical transitional period. So the tests that I guess I'm thinking about, I wouldn't say this is the government policy, is what is desirable from our point of view, what do we actually want to achieve, and the Prime Minister started to work through that by going to Scotland and Wales and in her discussions within government, what's negotiable and then what's deliverable, because people like me will have to, what is the legal basis when somebody turns up at the border? What is the legal basis for an environmental regulation, domestic environmental regulation the day after Brexit? So all of that kind of thing needs to be worked through. So we've got to have as detailed an understanding of the day after as we do the process running through, and we'll have to work through exactly how that's going to work in the negotiations with the Commission and the Member States.
Excellent, thank you, Mark. Agata, do you have any thoughts on this sort of negotiation?
Yeah, Article 50. I think what you said is absolutely key, that when you sit at the negotiating table, with your mind that you are just about to leave the EU, you also you should have a clear idea of what kind of relationship you would like to have. So, as Michel said, Article 50 already gives you a little bit of room, because it clearly states that the EU and the departing member states will negotiate the terms of a withdrawal, keeping in mind the framework of the future relationship. Now, the question mark is, what do we understand by framework? And this is something that I'm not sure even lawyers actually came up with a clear idea. I agree with Michel that the lawyers, well, actually the lawyers are also divided on this issue. The clear idea from the EU side, and I think it's not actually in Britain's and EU's interest, is to have the divorce first, and then to negotiate a future relationship between Britain and the EU. And I think it would be problematic for both Britain and the EU side, because we would have this sort of legal and economic vacuum in between. And hence, you actually have some lawyers who argue that two negotiations could go in parallel. Some would add that because the future relationship should should fall within the framework of negotiations of international agreement, Britain would, in theory, have to leave at least for one day, you know, to sign the sort of agreement on the future relationship. But I guess, you know, we will be, the lawyers will be discussing it for the months and years to come. But, you know, being a lawyer but also working as an analyst, I've learned that the treaties say one thing and sometimes the political reality is something different. And you really need this political will. And what we don't need at this moment is this uncertainty, what would happen, you know, in between. And it's just that the business, both European and the British one, doesn't need this. Just a final remark on this, you know, from the EU may have a point to separate those two processes, because when you are a third country, your leverage is, you know, is lower than when you are a member state and you negotiate different forms of agreement. So there might be a logic behind this as well.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, you said earlier that you thought a transition was almost inevitable inside. It's just the timing of the two negotiations.
Well, I can't, Julian, I can't see my way through this, but after stopping being a civil servant, I've become a businessman, and in the last month I've had more board meetings than at any other period, and they've all been focused on what in the world do we do now, what preparations can we make, what do we need to do. And from the point of view of businesses, the prospect is very worrisome indeed, because, I mean, if we were to be, I cannot see how one avoids some form of hiatus. And the hiatus is sort of unbearable from a legal point of view. If you're dealing with a criminal, it's pretty unbearable from a commercial point of view too. But just as an example, how does Britain negotiate a free trade agreement with the European Union unless its position in the WTO has been regularized, and you know what what Britain is offering to its WTO partners, what its MTM offers are. But Britain isn't going to be able to join the WTO just like that. At best, it might be able to join on the day it leaves the EU, but I find that almost implausible. So there is a huge complication about sequencing everything so that there is never a legal vacuum. There is never a vacuum where a moment when businesses don't know what the appropriate, applicable law is, what the applicable rules are, what duties they have to pay, what bits of paper they have to provide at the borders. And I think that's going to be enormously difficult. And what worries me is that I think this disadvantages Britain as in Britain's negotiating position more than it disadvantages the EU's, because that's the way Article 50 was drafted by Martin Selmayr to make it very, very uncomfortable for a member state to do this. I mean, it was deliberate. And just make a thought experiment. Article 50 is invoked. We go on for 2 years, we have all these complicated negotiations, they get rather ill-tempered politically, and so we get to the 2-year point and we haven't got an agreement. What happens then? I mean, we've left. According to Article 50, we've left. But what happens? I mean, what laws are in place? What laws does the UK, what laws do the UK courts enforce? What do the customs officers do? What duties do they apply? It's really very confusing, and I mean, it's sort of so confusing that it's sort of unthinkable it would actually happen. But then, over the last few weeks, a number of unthinkable things have happened.
Andrew, it won't happen like that. Fortunately, it won't happen like that. I mean, you will need to have interim measures during which you might have a prolongation of the existing rules. I mean, things like that.
Yeah.
You will need to have that. So the uncertainty, in my view, for the business is not going to be about, today's rule. I mean, what do I tax now? What sort of customs tariff do I apply? That they will know. The uncertainty will be about the future. I mean, that is the real uncertainty. What will be the terms of a free trade agreement which is not yet completely finalized, which needs to be further negotiated, which needs to be ratified by plenty of member states. That is the uncertainty the business will probably face, but it's not, fortunately, a sort of technical daily, today's uncertainty, I hope.
Well, I hope.
Mark, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, in a sense, Article 50 is the prenup, isn't it? And it's the prenup to try and ensure that actually nobody wants to leave the relationship. But the truth is, we are going to leave the relationship. It's a new reality, and therefore, it's in everyone's interest to make that work as effectively as possible. So we mustn't. You're absolutely right, Andrew. We mustn't underestimate the practical, technical, and legal obstacles that we have to navigate our way through. It is unprecedented. No country's done it before, so we're going to be inventing this as we go. But as we know with the EU, and as Michel referred to earlier, the treaties do allow a certain amount of scope, and in the end, if there is a strong enough political will to make it work and to ensure that there is a seamless transition from membership to a relationship beyond, that's still a close partnership from outside the EU, then it is all the job of people like me and a lot of lawyers to figure out how to make that happen. We're not going to impress Chancellor Merkel or the British Prime Minister by saying, oh, it's all technically very difficult. The answer will be, go fix that, go find a way through that. Here is the political objective we have set. And it's that will determine where we go, recognising that, of course, there are 27 other countries who will be part of setting that political objective as well as here. So we mustn't underestimate them. I don't dismiss them at all, Andrew. I'm not seeking to do that. But I do think we have to remember this is fundamentally a political process, and it's the job of experts to enable that political process to go ahead.
Yeah. I think in my experience, I'm sure many people in this room will have found that when you don't have political alignment, you can quite rapidly get nowhere. The second it comes, suddenly a huge amount of problems that were insurmountable disappear. So I suspect the politics are going to be the real crucial bit here. Hannah, what do you think? I mean, looking at that more broadly, what are likely to be the stumbling blocks if we, for the UK, and indeed everyone, wants to get to an agreement as rapidly as possible? What are likely to be the big issues that might come up that might make these negotiations actually extend because people are differing, if you like, political fundamental interests inside them? Sure.
Well, I think that you can distinguish between stumbling blocks which we might encounter internally within the UK and then the stumbling blocks which we might encounter externally. So obviously, as Mark was saying, the government has made evident that it's putting a big priority on the need to have UK-wide consensus on an approach to Brexit. So I think there's an obvious question there about whether it's possible to find an approach to Brexit which is acceptable both to Scotland and Northern Ireland and to England and Wales, who obviously the nations who voted in different ways. If an agreement, a UK-wide agreement, doesn't prove easy to secure, which seems possible, then we have the question of what the UK government does about that. And if the UK government decides to proceed regardless, then that could be quite destabilising for the union. So that's potentially a sort of one of the obvious internal stumbling blocks. And then in terms of external stumbling blocks, and we've already covered the fact that a new relationship is going to have to be ratified by all the other European countries who may have different issues with different aspects of a new relationship, and some of them may have to have referendums, and some of them have subnational bodies who get a say in this. And I think Philip Hammond was saying the other day that he thought just that ratification process across the EU could take up to 4 years in and of itself, even once an agreement was concluded. And then there's the other factor which has been raised about elections, major elections, German federal elections in 2017, French presidential elections. Both the process of those campaigns for those and the outcome of them could play into the negotiations process, I think. So, as well as the process being complicated in and of itself, there are these external factors which may play in.
Thanks, Hannah. Agatha, on that sort of future politics in the EU, the 2017 elections in Germany and France have come up a lot inside the UK debate. How do you think that might play out, and will that sort of mean that we can't do really serious negotiations until we get to the other side of those elections and whatever governments emerge?
It will be definitely a factor in negotiations. First of all, we don't know when exactly Britain triggers Article 50. So, but we assume, right, that it should be probably by the end of the year. Europeans, some officials from some member states say that they expect Britain to trigger it by December, the latest. Now, then indeed the negotiations, or at least actually agreeing on a mandate for the Commission or EU's negotiator, sort of coincide with the elections. You mentioned France and Germany, but there are also elections in the Netherlands, as far as I'm concerned, in March. The Netherlands, France and Germany, these are all key, or well, very important partners, Britain's partners, but also important actors in those negotiations. Not only this, they all have also their internal problems with Eurosceptic forces. I mean, France, Marine Le Pen, but also the Netherlands, Mr. Wilders, and Germany, perhaps to some extent also, well, AfD. So basically the fact that there will be elections in those countries is a problem for both Britain, but also those countries themselves in the way they approach negotiations. Now, for Britain, it might be the problem because there might be sort of, reluctance to discuss some sensitive issues whenever the campaign is in full spring, particularly those concerning actually free movement of EU labourers. It seems to me that this is quite sensitive, perhaps also financial services to some extent, perhaps in France and the Netherlands. So there might be an attempt to maneuver or to push back some of the talks, but also those countries themselves will find they will find themselves in a very delicate position where, by taking a softer stance, they might actually give additional ammunition, fuel to Eurosceptic forces in their countries, which will say, oh look, Britain is just about to get a special deal. Why won't we leave the EU and also go down the same path? So again, I mean, it seems to me it will be problematic. We discuss mainly elections, but there are also some other events, external events that will play a role. We don't know what happens with Greece eventually. We don't know what happens with the Italian banks. We don't know how the EU actually will deal with the refugee crisis, keeping in mind, the circumstances in Turkey as well. So all those and this uncertainty and actually a series of crises that the EU has to deal with, which for many of those member states are actually priority, will affect the way they approach Brexit negotiations. It seems to me Britain would obviously expect that, that this issue is prioritized, but some member states might be distracted with their domestic campaigns, but also with other crises that the EU has been beset with.
Okay, thank you. And a lot of uncertainties there. Maybe we can bring some certainty into this sort of debate, Michel. One of the sort of questions that's come up, and actually I think it's probably UK government policy now, is about striking the balance, that we can start our trade deals with third countries, Australia, the United States, etc. Start the negotiations now and have those ready to go for when we actually leave the EU, so we can essentially sign them 24 hours later or whatever. What do you think what's the probability of that? Is that a viable route for the UK to take?
Well, that's a tricky question, no? The lawyer will normally, in particular the Commission's lawyer, normally should reply that to begin any negotiation with a third country on trade, which is an exclusive competence of the Union, while still being a member state, is a breach. It is an infringement. So that's the reply of the lawyer. This being said, as we can read in Article 50, all this has to be seen in light of the framework, and you might expect that the Commission thinks twice before filing an infringement against UK for beginning trade negotiation with third countries when the outcome is indeed, at relatively medium term, an exit of UK. Now, this probably goes for the informal negotiations. I'm not sure it does work for the real signature and adoption of these trade deals, which probably will need to get ready, but have to be postponed until actual exit, so that at least you do not have a formal absolute breach of this. So that's how I see it. I think informally there will be contacts, and probably rather sort of sophisticated contacts. On what basis? It's going to be difficult, because while this exit negotiation carries on, well, the existing EU trade agreements with all these third countries are still valid, with UK in them. So one has to bear that in mind as well. It will be a very strange period, this period when UK will be negotiating its exit and still be a member state. I cannot exclude that a Luxembourg court case against UK appears at that point. How will it be accepted? UK is supposed to take the presidency in the second semester of 2017. You have sort of paradox.
We decided not to.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm sure that's wise.
Excellent, thank you. Mark, just briefly on that, obviously I read in my papers that we are engaging in informal discussions with other countries at the moment. Do you think we're worried that we might have infringement proceedings against us from the Commission, or are we simply going to, this is not the world of the real politics, obviously we're going to be negotiating and that's the way the government's going to take this?
I think it goes to the point that Michel made. I think I agree with Michel's analysis there, that I'm a diplomat by background and I'm running the Home Office, but I'm a diplomat by background. Talks about talks, agreements in principle, things that are initial before they're signed, all of this kind of thing is the meat and drink of international negotiations, whether those are multilateral or bilateral. So I think, again, with some ingenuity and goodwill, it should be possible to do all of these things in parallel, but then maintain the formal legal continuity that Michel was talking about, and how quickly then one moves through the transition into a new set of arrangements. Of course, will be a political judgment at the time, but our new International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, is intending to go out and start talking to countries about the kind of relationship they will have with us. That's going to be quite a prolonged process, I would imagine. But it's going to start with a political level conversation, say with, India or the United States or whatever, and then start to get into, okay, what does this look like, and how different might it be from the arrangements that we already have as a member of the EU, and of course that will be closely affected by where we end up in our relationship with the EU on the single market and trade question. Again, I think with goodwill, ingenuity, it is possible to manage that in a way that remains clearly lawful, but enables us to achieve the political objective.
Great, thanks, Mark. Before I go for comments from the audience, Hannah, just one other thing. We haven't mentioned the UK Parliament at this stage. What role do you think they're going to end up playing in this? And I know there's a court case sort of somewhere out there already.
There's more than one.
Yeah, indeed. How do you think this is going to play?
Sure. So the court cases are focused on Parliament's legal role in triggering Article 50. We saw the first hearing yesterday, and I think a date set for October for the Supreme Court to look at that. Does Parliament have to either have pass some sort of resolution or indeed primary legislation in order for Article 50 first to be triggered, because the ultimate effect of Article 50 would be to take us to mean that we had to repeal the 1972 European Communities Act, which was something that Parliament did, and can you do that just by prerogative? That's the question that those cases are exploring. But I hope that Parliament's role in the negotiation process and exploring the UK's future relationship with Europe will be a great deal more than just whether that sort of technical thing is required. I hope that Parliament will see this see Brexit as an important development in our country's history, and something that they really need to organise and make a significant contribution to the process of. I think there are some key obvious things that Parliament will be doing. Parliament will be scrutinising the negotiations to the extent that it is possible to scrutinise negotiations. and that will take goodwill from Parliament and from government, and finding ways of keeping Parliament up to date on what's going on. I think Parliament will need to continue scrutinising EU legislation, which will continue to flow from Europe, and which, depending on the future relationship we end up with Europe, may continue to be relevant to the UK, so the existing scrutiny systems will need to be operating. I think a really important role for Parliament will be making sure that different voices and constituencies are heard by government when government's considering the different trade-offs involved in different possible deals, that the interests of different interest groups across the country are heard and fed into government. So I think Parliament potentially could play a really big role. I hope that Parliament will organise and do that in a coordinated way, and that we won't see too many different committees going off in different directions and trying to call the same witnesses multiple times and things like that. But I'm sure Parliament will rise to the challenge.
Excellent, thank you. Right, just questions or comments from the floor. Please identify yourselves and then we'll go from there. Lady here first.
Hi, good afternoon. Gail Autumn with Tate & Lyle Sugars. I wanted to pick up on a couple of points, one made by you, Andrew, and the other by Michel. I think your reference to the WTO is critical in all of this. It seems to us from our analysis that the UK's membership, that all needs to be thought about. And linking that to your point, Michel, about the UK would be able to begin substantive discussions with third countries. It's unclear to us on what basis they could do that, because if you haven't got WTO membership, if you don't know what your external tariffs are, what are you negotiating? And in agriculture, in fact, you would need to first determine what your domestic policy is going to be. So the order to us seems to be WTO membership, domestic policy, and then third country FTAs. But obviously it gets a lot of press coverage. It was very high profile during the referendum campaign, and any clarity on that would be very interesting.
That's great. We'll take the comments first before we come back. Gentleman there.
Right, Graham Hudson. I'm here as a private individual. The chair, Julian Dimbleby, has very kindly effectively asked my written question, or at least the main part of it. Thank you for the panel's answers. There was a supplementary, which was, whilst we're still in Europe, presumably we still are involved through the Commission, in the negotiations on TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is a bit controversial in places. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And then lady there, and then finally lady there.
Thank you. Kate Shoesmith from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. You started to touch on the external factors and business confidence at the minute. How much do you think that business outlook, the economic outlook, and particularly the jobs market? So if we get today, I was thinking about it because today's we had the ONS labour market data again. How much will all of that, so if we get a big fall in employment numbers, how much will that impact on the negotiations?
Okay, thank you. There, Max behind you.
Thank you. Carol Hayden, independent researcher. A lot of the discussion so far has been on negotiations around free trade and the possible implications of that for free movement of labour. I wondered about negotiations on other related EU policies. I'm thinking of like the Common Agricultural Policy, Fisheries Policy, legislation and directives on employment, environment. To what extent will they be important to maintain, be consistent with for any deals on free trade? And or will the UK need to think about how it's going to put alternative policies in place to replace those European ones?
That's great. I'll just squeeze one more in, the gentleman there at the stand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Noel Lloyd. Just wondering really aloud how the devolved administrations will actually be involved in the negotiations themselves.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you very much. Andrew, I think you had one of the top questions just on picking up on the WTO point, and then Michel as well on the sort of basis around that. So you want to kick off there, but also pick up any of the others. There's TTIP, how the business outlook is going to affect us, some of the wider EU regulatory bits. If you want to pick up one or two of those.
Well, the question that I thought expressed it excellently. It's a big question, and government now needs to think about those and come out with some suggestions about how to proceed. But as I said earlier, I can't myself currently see how we conclude free trade agreements with third countries until we have some clarity about what our domestic agricultural policy is, until we know what bound tariffs we want to apply, and so forth, and what our membership of the WTO would impose. But I mean, that's a conundrum the government, Liam Fox will be addressing at the moment. But I think the other questioner's point about business outlook is a key one. I mean, I don't want to talk things down. I think you can actually be quite encouraged by what's happened over the last month. You know, businesses do continue. Foreign investors are still buying British companies, sometimes controversially, but they're buying them. But I think if we do find ourselves dipping into a recession, if it becomes clear that foreign investors are really spooked by the uncertainties, and if indeed there is a broader economic problems in the world beyond Britain, beyond the European Union, I do think that will have an impact on the negotiations, but then it always does. I just repeat my sort of earlier plea that government listens to business. So far, there hasn't been much evidence of that. And I hope very quickly that the various business departments, and there are a lot of them just at the moment, sort out a consultation process with all elements of business and allow them to feed into the negotiations.
Michel, do you want to pick up on any of that points that were raised?
I think it's a matter of policy from the UK government, indeed. I mean, they have to set their priorities, to set what they want to change in the sectorial activities, I mean, fisheries, environment, or whatever, and indeed make up their mind on the sequence of these events. But you're right, WTO partnership membership is a key element of that. On TTIP, well, nobody knows the future of TTIP, but in case it would happen medium term, maybe after UK Brexit, then UK is in the difficult situation which is now faced by Australia or Mexico or countries like that, which if there is a big trade agreement, a modern and very sort of innovative really trade agreement between the US and the EU, these countries are rushing to have the same deal. But they are not included in the deal. So you have now Australia being super interested in where the negotiations on TTIP are because they want to be part of it, but they can't be part of it, so they have to negotiate a similar agreement with the US on the heels of this agreement. So this is the type of situation which is evolutive, and indeed, in the meanwhile, UK remains a member and therefore participates in the negotiation to TTIP.
Excellent. Agatha, just on the WTO point, it's something we've been discussing quite a lot internally as to how this plays out. And there's certainly a lot of people saying there are a lot of technical difficulties here. We've heard that, lots of technical difficulties in lots of areas as we've been talking through here. But, you know, it seems that, you know, other countries have changed their relationship in WTO. I think Czechoslovakia, admittedly, it was under the previous, the GATT sort of agreement, but they were, within 4 months, they were signed up from the partition. So is it really going to be that difficult as long as there's enough political alignment? There's a lot of trade relationships out there. If the UK is not hanging out for the toughest deal ever, it's got very free trade ministers in charge at the moment. Is WTO really going to be a barrier to us?
Well, I'm not really an expert on Slovakia, but Slovakia is a member of the EU, and hence, I mean, its relationship with the World Trade Organization is different than a member state which is not part of the EU. I think that we all shared frustration when the Brexiteers were saying that Britain could enter the World Trade Organization in the course of the night. But I fully share your concerns. Britain would probably have to negotiate with each individual member a new sort of tariffs arrangement. So that won't be really that easy. But this is, you know, this is a more nuanced picture which is missing in lots of those discussions. The same thing with those transitional membership of the European Economic Area that sometimes is being floated around. Again, it seems to me, Michel, correct me if I'm wrong, that Britain would have to negotiate this as well. Couldn't just join again overnight. So I guess we need all a little bit more clarity, perhaps. You know, the final point, we've been discussing, you know, the withdrawal negotiations and the future relationship between the EU and Britain. There is a very important element that Michel mentioned, that the European Parliament will be involved in, so we'll have to approve the agreement on Britain's withdrawal, even if this agreement has nothing to do with mixity, even if it is not mixed. It seems to me that some parliaments may want to actually have a say on this and may want to have at least a debate in their, you know, individual member states, especially that this withdrawal agreement would touch upon rights of EU migrants. We already have an example of CETA agreement, which even though the Commission is saying this is not a mixed agreement, it will still go through the ratification procedures. So again, there might be some scrutiny also, as you mentioned, but for some seen as stumbling blocks. And the same thing with the agreement on the future relationship between the EU, which will almost certainly be a mixed one.
Excellent, thank you. Mark, I don't know whether you're now an expert on WTO membership and things like that, but you might also want to pick up perhaps how the devolves will be included, and also Andrew's point about business. Have we got clarity on how our multiple business departments are going to actually interact with?
Well, I do think it's a bit unfair to say, you know, it hasn't happened so far, given you know, the government's been in place, the new government's been in place for a week, and the first thing the new Prime Minister did was to go to Scotland, the second thing was to go to Wales, and the third thing was to go to Germany. So I think, you know, showing that there is an approach here that is going to be inclusive and engaged has been a pretty big signal of her first 7 days in office, to be fair to her. So the formalities of that, I think, are still to be worked through. It was clearly a very productive and business-like meeting in Scotland with the First Minister, and there's a commitment to continue to make that work. But the formalities of exactly how the devolved administrations and indeed the wider UK community, business, Parliament, etc., is still to be worked through. But the government's been clear that this is to be a national position that we are taking. I mean, in the end, judgments will have to be made, but it's a national position that we'll be taking into the negotiations, and as far as possible, one that commands a widespread national consensus. That's not straightforward, and it's, again, as I've been suggesting, you know, a highly political process. I mean, the formalities can be made to work if the politics works, and if the politics are aligned. If the politics aren't aligned, actually, all of the formalities in the world don't really bring them together. So that commitment is clear, and I'm sure business will be engaged. I'm not an expert on the WTO, so I'm going to leave that one for others.
Excellent, thank you. Right, thank you very much for that. Well, our final theme was about how to engage the public in all of this, and as is traditional for these sort of formats, we're a little bit short on time, and we'll finish at the end, and the music plays or whatever that is. But I just wanted to kick off a sort of little bit of a discussion on this, which we'll probably pick up at the Institute going forward. I mean, we've had a big exercise in direct democracy, and I'm wondering about views on how the public in the UK can be involved in both the negotiations and the final deal, how that will play into our political system, because it's obviously going to make a big difference to how the UK operates. There are various examples that have been highlighted by questioners as to whether they might or might not be useful. Would there be a green paper setting out the issues? I think the FT has sort of proposed that. I'm not sure we do green papers anymore in the UK government, but anyway. And then apparently a royal commission as recommended by 1,000 barristers. I'm not quite sure where that will mean, but if people have other ideas that they want to chuck into the mix. Hannah, do you want to just quickly kick us off and try and keep comments and brief on this if we can?
Sure. Well, I think, Andrew pointed out that, you know, it's a proportion of the UK's population who have voted for Brexit. But I think it is important to bear in mind this was a big exercise in direct democracy. We did see turnout of 72%, which was higher than the last general election. So, you know, people really did engage with this question, which is, you know, a good thing. I guess in terms of sort of maintaining the sort of mandate for the deal and so on, and how the public could be involved in that, there were probably, I guess, three main options. One is that the government thinks that the existing referendum has given it a mandate to deliver whatever deal it now believes as, you know, with our normal model of representative democracy, as the government should now be delivered. The second option is that at some point in the negotiation process we'll have a general election and different parties will stand with different views on the deal, and then the outcome of the election will provide a mandate one way or the other on whether the deal should go forward. And the other option that's been floated is the idea of having a second referendum on the deal, and so having the option at that point, do we go with this deal, or and I guess the alternative at that point is, do we stay in the EU? But then there's a question about whether Article 50, once invoked, is reversible, which seems to be something that lawyers don't entirely agree on yet.
Andrew, any thoughts on how this might play out?
Well, I think that there are a whole series of rather interesting constitutional issues which have been raised by the referendum and the subsequent, what's following from it. And part of it is indeed the question: what are the place of referenda in our constitution, in our democracy? Because we've now had 2 referenda within a few years, which are about profound issues about the future of our nation. But we don't have any actually agreed, we don't even have any conventions about referenda. So I think that one of the debates that will happen is any future referenda we have, how do they fit, what rules are there, how do they fit into our constitution? It seems to me clear that the issue of the 4 nations within our United Kingdom has been raised, and it's a genie which has come out of the bottle, and I can't see us getting to the end of this set of negotiations without some sort of new settlement between the 4 nations. I also think there's been a big issue raised about the executive as opposed to Parliament. I mean, for me, one of the great ironies is that one of the arguments for leaving, for Brexiteers was our sovereignty, and sovereignty in Britain lies in Parliament. It doesn't lie in the executive; it lies in Parliament. So for me, it's rather self-evident that Parliament should actually have, be the place where sovereignty is exercised on this issue. But anyway, there's a big debate to be had about that. And lastly, there is actually a big issue raised about the nature of our civil service, and I think that's something for the Institute for Government to focus on particularly, because it's quite clear that the relationship between departments is going to change. The structure of departments already has changed and may need to change further. The size of the civil service, at least on a temporary basis, is going to have to change, and the skills base of the civil service changes. And so there are some really quite important implications for the machinery of government in all of this, which I think will play out over the coming years.
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, obviously, in the now famous words of the Prime Minister, Brexit means Brexit for the UK. And I think the Liberal Democrats are campaigning on the second referendum, but at 8 seats and not necessarily a major political force. But there came up in sort of hands. Is there just a very quick lawyerly comment, Agata, about Michel? Is there a way back? Is there any point in doing anything like that? Because presumably legally we don't have a route back in this.
I feel I'm probably the worst place to reply to that, because the track record of referenda on Europe is that they are not implemented. Basically, normally the reaction is, well, people haven't quite understood the question, let's ask again. Let's ask again, or put it differently. And basically, that's how it has almost always happened so far. So the precedents are not are relatively clear. And lastly, in France in 2005, and the Netherlands for the same Lisbon Treaty, basically. So I don't know. I think UK is going to set a very good precedent that referenda finally means something, which will be new.
Excellent, thank you. From my Irish observation, I think the one crucial difference is in Ireland the government actively sought not to implement the referendum, whereas I think this government is pretty actively trying to implement the referendum, which may make quite a big difference.
Of course.
We are setting an example for Europe in popular democracy. Agata, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think it's up to Britain really to determine whether it wants to have a second referendum or not. I mean, the EU will not dictate whether Britain should, whether Britain is allowed to change its mind. Now, again, there is some ambiguity whether, once Britain triggers Article 50, whether it can actually, again, change its mind. There are different opinions. I think that there is nothing really to prevent Britain from changing its mind. There are actually some the member states that hope that Britain will never leave the EU. That's the case with the country I know the best, that's Poland. And basically, the leaders, the political elites, they're saying this on the record. And then, Article 50 also says that even if you left the EU, you can always reapply, but then forget about all the opt-outs, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, have you final word? Maybe I don't think it's your place to comment on direct democracy or whether we're going to have elections or not. But is there anything that the government is currently thinking about bringing in the public more broadly? I mean, you've talked a lot about talking to the devolved nations and talking to business, but is there any thought going on about is there a wider set of issues that we need to engage with the public on?
I think it's I mean, just by the way, to be crystal clear, it is quite dangerous to start suggesting that the clear commitment of the government, Brexit means Brexit, is anything other than absolutely crystal clear. That is the policy. Don't anybody fool themselves. It's going to change. It's not. That is crystal clear. And we have to proceed on that basis, make a success of the negotiations, make a success of the new position in the world the public have set for us. And not quibble around the edges of it. However, the parliamentary and sort of political system as a whole determines the mandate and determines the mandate for the final negotiation. The referendum decision is clear, and that's it. In terms of engagement with the public, I think it's quite clear this is going to be a huge public issue over the next few years. Again, we've only had the new government in place for a few days. Clearly, the Prime Minister set a direction of engaging through the big political institutions. Parliament, of course, is representative, and as Agata said, and Andrew said, is sovereign. It will be for her and them to work out how to engage the public, formally or informally. But the direction is clear, and of course, the government has a mandate, not only from the general election last year, but now from the referendum to negotiate a successful departure from the EU and a new place in the world, and that's got to be the commitment.
Excellent, thanks, Mark. And always useful to end on a point of crystal clarity in these sort of things. Look, thank you all very much for your participation. As you might imagine, none of these issues are going away anytime soon, and the Institute will be continuing to look at them, is indeed the wider issues from Brexit that I mentioned at the start. But thank you very much, and if you could thank our panel for the excellent discussion.